Good morning. Hey, it's Veterans Day weekend. We want to take a moment and recognize any veterans, wartime or peacetime. If you're a veteran, we just want to honor you. Just maybe stand up if you're willing. Any veterans in this service? Let's give it up. Give it up for our veterans. We are grateful. Hey, today we get to do something exciting. Many of you know, if you've been around a while, that as a part of our Elevate initiative, kind of this 2-year generosity journey that we're on, we're in the home stretch. That as a part of that, we're doing what's called the Life for Reno grant, where we're giving away $100,000 to local nonprofits and ministries. We've already awarded the first and the largest of those, $50,000 to New Life Assembly of God in the North Valleys that was flooded out of their building. I got to stop by there this week. They're making great progress. They've actually already moved back in, even though they're still kind of doing some finishing touches, and so they're making great progress there. And then we awarded a large grant to the Pathfinders Ministry to purchase another van. And then today we get to award a grant for $20,000 to Awaken, which is an incredible ministry, one of my favorite ministries in our city that helps ladies that are kind of find themselves trapped in sex-related industries. And so we've got Melissa Holland with us today, the executive director of Awaken. Let's welcome Melissa to the stage. Melissa, we love Awaken. We love your ministry. We love it as corporately as a church, ton of LifeChurch people individually just love being a part of Awaken. And so we're thrilled to give you this grant for $20,000.
Thank you guys so much. So just to share a little bit of what this is going to go to, I don't know if you guys have heard, but we just recently announced we are the recipients of a very generous couple who has actually purchased a home for Awaken to use. So we will be able to house 5 adult women exiting prostitution. It will be the first home in Northern Nevada dedicated specifically for women exiting prostitution and sex trafficking. And so this is going to help us to actually open that home, start this, and so these women are going to be able to come in. It is a long-term 2-year transitional program. For 2 years, these women are going to be able to receive healing, recovery, love, and any type of ministry services that are going to help them to actually exit this and go back into lives that God intended for them. So thank you so much. We couldn't do it without the help of the community.
Now let's thank God for Awaken. Good stuff. Hey, so last week we kicked off a series in the book of Nehemiah. Calling it Building a Life That Counts. And so last week, we kind of were introduced to Nehemiah, a regular guy who made his life count in a really big way. And really throughout the Bible, over and over and over again, we see this story of just a regular person that responds to God's activity in their life. God does big things in them and through them. We see this with Abraham. We see it with Moses. We see it with Ruth and Esther and David, Mary, Jesus, his mom. We see the apostles, just regular people that God does big stuff in their life. And so we kind of see this background. Nehemiah is cupbearer to this king. The people of Israel have been exiled and in captivity, and Jerusalem is in shambles. The wall is torn down, and the city's a mess. Nehemiah gets this word, and it breaks his heart. He weeps and he prays. And so today we catch up, and today we're going to talk about how if I'm going to build a life that counts. Last week we said, man, a lot of it is just I've got to care. But today I want to talk to you about if I'm going to build a life that counts, I've got to maximize the influence that God's given me. If you have your Bibles, go over to Nehemiah 2. Fair. Nehemiah 2. Hey, so last week we saw in chapter 1 how Nehemiah gets word that the city of Jerusalem is in shambles. He's 1,000 miles away. He's cupbearer to the king. And then he finds out that the city of Jerusalem is in shambles. The wall is down. It's in a total mess. And then he gets this incredible burden. And we talked last week that if we're going to build a life that counts, it really begins with just caring. We've got to care. And so Nehemiah gets this burden, and he weeps and he prays. And then he decides that God is calling him to make a difference. And so that's where we catch up in chapter 2. We see in chapter 2, verse 1. It says in the month of Nisan. Now, Nisan is the month of April. And so we saw last week in the month of Kislev, which is like November. So we're talking 5 months later. And so what it looks like is you just kind of read this story, is it looks like that Nehemiah spent the last 5 months. He's been weeping, he's been praying, and he's been planning. And maybe you're in a moment in your life where you feel like there's something coming, but you feel like you're on hold a little bit. You feel like you're in a moment of waiting. And I want you to know that moments of waiting on the Lord are never wasted moments. And so that's where we catch up. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. That was his job. And he says, now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? Kings in that day, the expectation was that if you worked for them, that you were always at your best. And so you didn't go around the king looking all sad. If you were, it could actually cost you your life. And so the king looks at Nehemiah and says, why do you look so sad? He said, I know you're not physically sick. He says, what's going on? And you kind of get the impression here that Nehemiah had been asking God to open the door, and that would be the opportunity for that he would take advantage of. And the moment has come when the king asked the question. The king says, this is nothing but sadness of the heart. He says, then I was very much afraid. He knew it was not a good thing to look sad in front of your boss, the king, who actually held the power of life and death over you. He says, this is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. Then I said to the king, let the king live forever. Every king wanted to hear that. It was a common way that kings were greeted, that they would live forever. It was many times wished and never accomplished. He says, may the king live forever. He says, why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Here's the first thing we see about Nehemiah. I want to talk to you today about building a life that counts. And part of what Nehemiah does is that Nehemiah maximizes his influence. And if you're going to build a life that counts, it really, in some ways, it begins with taking advantage of the influence that you've been given. And the first step for that is to realize that God has placed you in positions for influence. So Nehemiah finds himself with access to the king that most would never have. He was a servant, but he was a servant that had access. He was a servant that had access in some of the king's best moments. And so he recognizes that he's been placed in a position for influence. And so what happens is he looks for the right time. And so he looks for that right time when the king is probably having a feast. He talks about this language. It's the moment where the king's wine was before him. It may have been a feast. It may have been a celebration. And so he looks for that right moment. And then he does it with the right tone. He begins and he says, may the king live forever. He begins by kind of buttering up the king a little bit. See, he doesn't come in with a bunch of complaining. Look what your people did to my people. Look what your people have let happen to my people, and look what all this has happened, and you're oppressing us. He didn't come at it with that, but he came at it at the right time, and he came at it with the right tone. If you want to maximize your influence, timing and tone absolutely matter. Kids, if you want to maximize your influence with your parents, timing and tone are almost everything. And so Nehemiah recognizes that, but he recognizes that God had sovereignly placed him in a position of influence. One thing I love about Nehemiah is he's just a regular guy who makes a big difference with his life. And really, as you read the Bible, over and over and over again, that's the story we see over and over and over again. Just regular people that God uses to make a big difference. We see that in the life of Abraham. We see that in the life of Moses, the life of Joseph. We see that in Ruth and Esther. We see that in all the apostles. These are just regular people that God then uses in a big way. And I believe that's God's heart for you. I believe that's God's heart for us, that he has invited us to join in on his big mission in the world, that we're regular people that he wants to use in a big way. And so Nehemiah recognizes that he's been placed with some influence. He's in the right place with the right person to accomplish what God has called him to accomplish. And here's what I think is true for you, and I think it's true for me. I think you have more influence than you recognize. I think that there are people that God's placed in your life that you just see them as people that you pass by. You just see them as people that you kind of know. You just see them as just people that are acquaintances or friends or family. But I believe that in each of those situations, these are people that God has given you influence in their life. And so that might be at home. That might be your kids. There's no one that you're going to influence more than your own kids. And so it might be your kids that you've got this massive influence on them. It might be the people you work with. You might have a coworker that you get to see every single day of the work week. And you think that you're just there to do a job. But actually, God's placed you there for a bigger purpose, to have some influence, to make a difference in that person's life. It might look like a friend. It might look like another parent on your kid's soccer team or baseball team. Or it might look like a kid that's on that baseball team. It might look like an extended family member. But I believe that we all have more opportunities for influence. God's placed us places for the purpose of being a light there, for the purpose of being an influence there and making a difference. God has placed you there with influence. Sometimes I'm amazed by when I think about all the people that go to LifeChurch. You know, there was about 1,200 between the two campuses last week, and a couple thousand that'll pass through over the course of a month. And I think about the fact that we've got teachers at almost every school in this city. We might have teachers at every school. When we're talking about influence, we've got people at both UNR and TMCC. We've got people that work at all the major hospitals. We've got people that work at all the major employers in this city. And it's as if God has just put people. And it's not simply so you can get a paycheck. And it's not simply, it's that it's bigger than that you're there for a bigger reason. God's placed you there with more influence than you recognize. And so if you're going to build a life that counts, it begins by maximizing your influence. But the first step to that is recognizing that you've got some. Recognizing that you are places where you are the best person to make a difference right there. Here's the next thing we see. Let's look at verse 4. I'm going to maximize my influence. I can't be afraid to do something big because God is with me. Look at verse 4. So this is Nehemiah's moment. The king says to him, "What are you requesting?" And I love the next thing. That in that moment, we know that Nehemiah has spent a chunk of time fasting and praying. But now it's the moment for action. But just because action has begun doesn't mean that prayer has stopped. So the king says, "Well, what are you asking for?" And it says the next thing he does is he just whispers a little prayer to God. A little silent prayer, a little, "Oh God." One of those prayers that begins with, "Oh God, this is happening. I've been planning for this moment. I've been praying for this moment, but this is the moment. And God, I've been asking you to help me, but I'm asking you again, I need you to help me." Because Nehemiah is about to make a request that if it goes bad, he could just be killed. It's that the stakes are high. And so we see here, verse 4, he says, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and then he talked to the king. He says, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight," so he still has the right tone. He says, "And if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, it almost gives the impression that maybe Nehemiah was excited to take advantage of this moment because maybe he knew that the wife's heart was a little softer than the husband's, which seems to happen about 95% of the time. And so maybe he knew that. He says, I did it when the queen was there because I thought, hey, he's usually less of a jerk when she's around. He says, "How long will you be gone? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. So here's Nehemiah is asking something incredibly big. He's saying, "Hey, I want you to let me off from my normal job, which is serving you. So I want you to give me time off. I want you to let me go and rebuild this city. I'm going to be gone a long time." And then he keeps going. And he says, so it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. He said, "Hey, it's going to be a long time." And then I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. That last verse, that last little part's the big part. Nehemiah knows that God's in this. Nehemiah knows that what he's doing is he's joining in on the activity of God. He knows that what he's done, that his heart, as we talked last week, has broken for something that God's heart was already broken for. He's joining in on the activity of God, and so because of that, there's no fear. There's no fear to go for something big. So here's what he does. He asks the king, he says, let me have this time off. Let me go and rebuild this city. And then he says, and by the way, I want you to pay for all of it. He says, hey, I want to go to your forest, and I want you to give me a letter so that I can get all the wood that I can get for this wall and this part of the temple, and I want to build myself a big, fine house to live in while I'm down there. And I want you to pay for it. I mean, it's a big ask. Big ask that he's making, that if it doesn't received right, could end up costing him his life. But he knows that God is with him. And here's the thing, if I'm gonna build a life that counts, I can't be afraid to try something big, because God is with me. I think, guys, many times God's looking at us, and I think he's looking at our lives, and I think he's saying, try something bigger. I think he's looking at us, he's saying, I'm with you, so stop trying to do stuff that you can do without me. I think he's saying, try something harder. Stop playing it so safe. Go for something bigger. I feel like one of the greatest challenges of our suburban lives is we value comfort, and we value convenience, and we value safety, and we value security, as if the worst thing that could happen to us is that we would die. When in reality, the worst thing that can happen to you is that you would never really have lived. Jesus said, if you really want to grasp hold of life, you've got to let it go. And so I think that suburbia has upside for sure. But man, the downside is it seems like it's mostly about how comfortable can we be, how convenient can my life be, how safe can it be, how secure can it be, as if the very worst thing that could possibly happen is that we would die. And in the midst of it, we live safe, little comfortable lives. And I think God's looking at us and saying, try something harder, try something bigger, try something risky, try something that you could only do with me. He wants to set us free from this emphasis on comfort, convenience, safety, security that keeps us from really, really living. What's something that maybe God might be calling you to? Our life group this week, on the heels of last week's message, talk about kind of what do you really care about? What do you really care about that breaks the heart of God? And what's keeping you from doing something about it? And what's something for you that maybe God's calling you to, something that will make a difference, something that really matters, something you know you can't do alone, something that maybe, that thing that if you knew you could not fail, what would you try to do? Something that if you were not trapped by circumstances or retirement plans, what would you try to do? If your biggest goal in life is just to endure a job you hate for the next 15 years so then you can retire and wait to die, God wants to set you free from that. He's got something more. Has your quest for comfort and safety and security robbed you of your passion and held you back from maximizing your life? Maybe for some of you, it looks like beginning to volunteer and mentor some at-risk kids. I know some of you are already doing that stuff. Maybe it looks like selling your business and starting the nonprofit you've always dreamed of. Maybe it looks like going on a mission trip to a place that looks scary. You say, hey, man, if I were to go, there's a great guy from our church, Gary Turner, who's right now in India. A place that a lot of us would look and say, man, I read about the stuff that's happening to Christians in India. That looks scary. The next time you look at something and you think that it looks scary, don't let that be the reason not to do it. Let that be the reason to do it. Do something scary. Maybe it looks like adoption. Maybe it looks like there's a lady in our church who's right now on a plane over to Africa to adopt their second kid. Maybe it looks like doubling or tripling the amount you serve here at LifeChurch. Maybe it looks like incredible generosity. What if, get this, what if it looked like all of that and more? What if see, what Nehemiah does is he recognizes that life's too short to play it safe, and that if God's given him this burden, it's his moment to go all in and to go big, even if it costs him his life. He totally goes for it. Here's the third thing. See from Nehemiah, look at verse 16. We can do more together than we can do alone. Look at chapter 2 and verse 16. So what happens is the king meets all of his requests. He says, I'm going to give you the time off. I'm going to let you go and rebuild the city. I'm going to pay for it. And then what happens is the king actually gives him even more. And he says, I'm going to give you a set of guards to make sure you get there safely. The king's all in because God has moved his heart. And then skip down to verse 16. So Nehemiah gets there, he kind of plays it low-key for a few days, kind of gets the lay of the land, and he says, the officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. And then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Hittite and so Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us. We're going to see that just because you're doing God's stuff doesn't mean it's always easy. We're going to see that in the next couple of weeks. These guys are against him the whole time. But then he says, then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we as servants will arise and build. And so here's what happens. He comes and he tells these people, he says, hey, I need you guys to help me. See, the truth is this, we can do more together than we could ever do apart. Nehemiah knew that God was with him. He knew that God had called him to do it, but he also knew that it was going to accomplish more with a team, that it was going to take more. And so he goes to these people and he says, hey, God's in this. He's called us to do this, and man, I need you guys to help. And they say, hey, we're all in. Let's arise. Let's build. Let's do this thing. And here's the thing. If you're going to maximize your life and maximize your influence, it's going to involve you mobilizing and inspiring and challenging people around you, saying, hey, get in on what God's doing. I need your help. This basic principle that we can do more together than we can apart. Ecclesiastes 4 says it this way. It says, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who's alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. It's this basic principle that we can accomplish a lot more together than we can apart. And so Nehemiah influences others to join in on this big thing that he's doing. Jesus understood this. One of the first things Jesus did as he begins his ministry is he builds a team. And then before he ascends into heaven, he invites all of us onto his team. He says, hey, go and make disciples. He's invited us. He says, as the Father sent me, now I'm sending you. And so if I'm going to maximize my influence, I'm going to do more if I can build a team. That's one of the great things about the wonder of the local church. Is how we can do so much more together than we can apart. And it's so cool, man. I see this on our staff. God's given us the greatest staff that all have different gifts and abilities. And man, you've got Pastor Tom, who's just incredibly caring and nurturing. And not that he doesn't know stuff about money, but then you got Scott Rhoda, and not that he's not nurturing and caring, but man, Scott Rhoda's this top shelf business guy. Those guys, I don't know if you noticed, those are different guys. Have you noticed Tom and Scott aren't the same guy? If you know them, you know. And But the thing of it is, man, our church is better because we've got both. Because we can do more together. Because it's better with a team. And that's the amazing thing about our ministry teams. You know, last week at LifeChurch, there was about 250 kids from birth through 5th grade. Can you imagine one person with infants through 5th graders, 250 of them? That would be like purgatory, right? You know, and so, I mean, kids are awesome, but one with 250, you know. But last week, I was looking at our rosters. Last week, there was over 60 adults across our 4 services here and then also at Midtown. Those 250 kids, there was about 60 adults that came together to love and to teach those kids about Jesus. It's just a picture of we can do so much more together than we can ever do apart. And so maybe God's given you a burden, something that breaks his heart, something that really matters, something that's bigger than your safe little world. And he's given you this burden, and you say, but you know what? I could do so much more if I had a team. It was really cool. Last week, I shared about how there's a guy in our church who feels like God's called him to make a massive difference on the clean water issue around the world. And he said that after service, just a couple of people, different families that heard me talk about that came up and said, hey, if there's anything we can do to help in what God's called you to do with this water thing, we want to help. It's just this thing that we can do more together than we can ever do apart. Here's the last thing. Go over to Nehemiah 5. God gives us power and influence to help those who have less. So we kind of fast forward in the story a little bit. We'll catch up here over the coming weeks, but what's happening is now there's been some more people that have come into Jerusalem, and the rich were taking advantage of the poor. And we see here, Nehemiah 5, beginning in verse 4, it says, hey man, we're losing our land, we're losing our vineyards, and there were those who said, we've borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, our children are as their children, yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for the other men have our... So you've got these people that are powerless. And then Nehemiah says, I was very angry, and I heard their outcry. He saw injustice, and he had the right response. He said, man, this isn't how it's supposed to be. God hates this. And so I'm going to join in on God's hatred of this. He says, I heard their outcry in these words. I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you're exacting interest, each from his brother. And I held a great assembly against them and said to them, we, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who've been sold to the nations, but you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us. He says, man, you're oppressing these people just like our enemies were oppressing us before. He says, they were silent and could not find a word to say. So I said, the thing that you are doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God, to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? Moreover, I and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon the exacting of interest, return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their orchards, their houses, their money, their grain, their wine, their oil that you've been exacting from them. And they said, we will restore these and require nothing. Here's what Nehemiah does here. What he does is he recognizes that God's given him power and influence. But when God gives us power and influence, and when God gives us anything, whatever God's given you, it's never just for you. That it's always this stewardship thing that I've been blessed, that I might be a blessing. And so Nehemiah recognizes, I've got power and I've got influence. And then these people over here, they don't have much power and they don't have much influence. And so I'm going to use what God's given me to help them. We see this in Proverbs 31, verse 8. Before you get to that portion of Proverbs 31 that talks about the really awesome wife, you see this portion where this king's mom is teaching him as a young man how to be a good king. And he says this, Proverbs 31, he says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, those without a voice, those no one's listening to. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and the helpless and see that they get justice. See, the thing is, man, whatever influence God's given you, it's not mostly for you. It's not only for you and your comfort and convenience, it's also for others. It's this principle that I've been blessed, not just for myself, but to be a blessing. And so your talents and your gifts and abilities, they aren't just for you. Your money and your stuff aren't just for you. Your family is not just for you. You've been blessed to be a blessing. Salvation, as great as it is not just for you. You've been changed, and now God's invited you on this mission, and your power and your influence are not just for you. And so if you're gonna build a life that counts, kind of recognizing that, man, God's given me influence, and I've got to maximize it. You know, after I had written this outline and I was chatting it through with our team, we were kind of reflecting on really this whole, all of this stuff is really in many ways what this whole Elevate initiative is about. We're in this final journey, kind of in everything between now and December 31st that's given to LifeChurch as a part of the Elevate initiative. It's been this 2-year spiritual journey that we've been on, God taking us to a new place with Him, and the overflow was a outpouring of generosity, allowing us to make a bigger difference than ever. But as I was thinking about it, that really what Elevate is about, it's about our church recognizing the unique opportunity to influence that God has given us, both at our Midtown campus, which is inside the most densely populated, diverse, unchurched part of our city, and then our South campus, which is in the fastest growing part of our city, where we're going to be the only evangelical church with a campus in this whole southeast quadrant. And I say, man, I can't think of two better places that God has given us, positioned us for influence. But here's the thing. There's moments I get so excited about that. I'm like, man, we're in these two incredible spots where God's gathered these great people. God's given us a great team. And at moments I see the opportunity of that, and I am excited. And then there's moments that I recognize that opportunity comes with this incredible responsibility. Those moments, it's sobering. And it's like, oh my goodness. Man, we can't blow this moment. And so really this Elevate thing, in many ways, it's about our church recognizing the unique opportunity that God's given us and maximizing it. Really what Elevate is it's really about us continuing the pattern of us trying to do hard stuff because we believe that God's in it. When we were first looking at moving here in 2005, I chatted with a bunch of church planting people in this city and kind of talked about the vision that God had given us. And over and over and over again, they just said story after story of reason why that wouldn't work, or that person tried that and it didn't work, and this and that. And then really just through this whole last 13 years, from when we began, when there's about 150 of us with about $7,000 in the bank, and we began to look at these 10 acres for about $2 million. And a little bit over $2 million, and began the process of trying to buy this property. And it was like, man, that looks like 150 of us. We have like $7,000. How in the world? And it was the idea that, man, that looks hard. But we believed God was in it. And then in the process of the first time we began to raise money to pay off that property and put us in a position to build, and at that time the church was like 400 or 500 people, and I was talking to a guy. I said, hey, man, we're praying that over the next few years that on top of our regular giving, it was like a separate fund thing, different than the one fund thing now, but at that time we said, hey, we're praying over the next 3 years that we'd see about $3 million come in above our regular giving so we could pay off this property and get ready to build and stuff. And this guy, friend of mine, who for a living help churches raise money, he said, hey, Dave, that's never, ever, ever going to happen. And I don't want to be a part of your failed capital campaign. He wouldn't even help me because he thought it was going to be a failure. The whole pattern of this whole journey has been God calling us to do hard stuff, but He was with us in it. When God laid it on the heart of LifeChurch and the Vineyard Church to become one church, everybody said, hey, those things never work out. All of those people are going to leave. None of the staff will stick around. Man, God's been so good. Some of the best people at LifeChurch came over, and they're here at South Campus still, a lot of people over at Midtown. And it was like, hey, God called us to do something hard, not because it was easy, but specifically because it was hard. And now as we're in this process of raising money so we can build the next phase here, and the money that went towards starting Midtown, the money towards building the church and the Compassion Project in Bolivia and the Life for Reno grant. Here's the thing. We don't do it because it's easy. It's like John F. Kennedy said, man, we're not trying to go to the moon because it's easy. Man, we're trying to go because it's hard. And that's really the whole spirit of this whole thing is hey, God, we want to be a part of stuff that's bigger than us. Man, elevates this amazing picture that we can do so much more together than we could ever do apart. Man, none of us together, none of us individually could do everything that's happened at LifeChurch over the last 2 years. From starting the Midtown campus, building all that out, growing that to a couple hundred folks, starting our preschool, seeing that filled up, where there's like 200 kids a week that come in here, and we get to teach those kids about Jesus. All the stuff that's from building the church in Bolivia and getting ready to break ground here in the spring. None of us could have done that by ourselves, but together, God can do so much more with us. And really, Elevate is recognizing that the stuff that God's given us is never just for us. Man, it's bigger than that. And so my final thought as I look at this story in Nehemiah is, man, would God give us that same spirit that he gave Nehemiah, where he saw stuff that just broke the heart of God. He cared so much that he said, God, I'm all in. And if that means I'm going to lose my job, I'm all in. If that means that life's going to be a lot harder for the next 2 years, the next few years than I thought it was going to be, then God, I'm all in. If that means that this king decides he's just going to kill me for asking, whatever it looks like, I don't want to be bound up by the chains of comfort and convenience and safety and security, all of the things that trap us and lead us to a life wasted. I've been spitting on you all morning, and I apologize.
That's all right.
You are a hero. This is a guy that's not scared. This is a guy that's making his life count. Did I spit on you too? No, you're so good. You protected her. God didn't give you that just for yourself, but to protect someone else. Hey, let me pray for you. Father, we love you. God, I pray that LifeChurch, God, corporately and then individually as we live our lives, God, that we'd be people that take big risks for you, that go big for you, that sacrifice comfort, security, safety, convenience, all of the things that keep us from our lives counting. God, that we would recognize that when we really find life is when we give it up for your sake. And it's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.